Give it 10 seconds.
All right, welcome to the third TransAsiaSTS network seminar. Apologies for those of you who are watching this introduction the second time for some technical issues. This is the third TransAsiaSTS network seminar. As I mentioned, my name is Gergely Mohácsi. I'm an anthropologist at Osaka University, Japan. For those of you who don't know much about the network, it was formed in 2020, TransAsiaSTS network. It is a scholarly exchange. It kind of promotes scholarly exchange and collaboration in the field of science and technology studies across Asia. This network aspires to connect existing STS institutions, societies, and networks in Southeast and Southeast Asia, Australasia, and the Pacific, and draw in scholars and organizations working beyond these established STS infrastructures as well. We are all supported by the infrastructures of transnational STS network. For those of you who want to know more about this and some of the events, you will have to wait until the end of this seminar where I will give you more details. So let me explain a little bit about the technicalities of this seminar today. Those of you who are watching it on YouTube, you know, it's streamed on YouTube. There is a chat box there, which is hosted by Tyler King today. Please feel free to introduce yourself there and use the chat to make any comments along the way. Please especially post questions for the speakers. We are going to have 4 speakers today, and Tyler is going to pass them on to us, and they are going to reflect on it later today at the question and answer time of this seminar. Also, you can ask questions on Twitter. Emma Kowal is going to host the live tweeting of this seminar using a hashtag TransAsiaSTS. So feel free to add your live tweets or comments there too, and you can post any questions for the speakers using this hashtag, and Emma is going to pass them on to me here. A few words about the background of this seminar before we start and the schedule for today. So today we are hosting an open roundtable to discuss some of the themes and ideas that emerged from a special issue that was edited by Casper Brun-Jensen, who is one of the speakers today, and was published in the journal East Asian Science, Technology and Society. Last year in July, 2021 July. The title of the special issue was Material Itineraries, Southeast Asian Urban Transformations. The participants today will include both authors of this special issue and also 2 discussants who I will call readers of the special issue. Our aim in this seminar is to further develop the conceptual and the empirical possibilities that have been raised or have been emerging at the intersection of STS and urban studies during the past decade, using this special issue as an occasion to do so. So Casper Brun-Jensen is going to talk about the aims and purpose of this special issue in more detail in his introduction. Casper is an anthropologist of science and technology and currently resides in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. And then we are going to have 2 comments from authors, one from Jakrit Sankamane, who is an associate professor in anthropology at the Faculty of Political Science, Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok. Then we are going to have Katrin Eitel, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Social Anthropology and Cultural Studies at the University of Zurich. Then we are going to have 2 commentators, readers. One, Fadyar Ibn Tufail, who is the Director of Research Center for Area Studies of the Indonesian National Research and Innovation Agency. And from a recorded video, we are going to have one more discussant, Iti Abraham, who is a professor at the School for the Future of Innovations in Society at Arizona State University. Iti was really keen to be with us today, but due to the time difference, it's over midnight over there. So we decided to have his comments as a recorded video. Then we are going to have a discussion based on the questions raised in the comments, and later we are going to open it up to your questions from YouTube and Twitter that we are going to, or the authors and commentators are going to respond here in the YouTube. So without further delay, let me hand it over to Casper, who is going to present the introduction to today's seminar and tell us more about the purposes and aims of this special issue that was published a year ago. So, Casper?
All right. Let's see. This one. Okay. Thank you very much, Gerge, for doing the introduction twice. I hope it works now. Thank you also very quickly to TransAsia for the kind invitation, and to Iti Abram and Fajar Tufail for reading and commenting later on. And I also want to say thank you to the East General Editor, Wen Huapo, for making the special issue here available, because Gerge was saying probably we have a bunch of readers by now, but it's my sense we probably don't have a terrible amount of readers, in part because of COVID, and in part because the issue has been behind a paywall, which has now been removed by Benoit. So you'll all be able to actually have a look at the papers that make up the thing we're going to be discussing. So I only have like 8 or 10 minutes. And so there's no way I can go through a whole issue or even comment on the specific papers in any detail. I do want to mention that aside from Jakrit, who will be talking about his paper, and Catherine, who will be talking about hers, we did have 2 other contributors, Gerge himself, who contributed a really nice paper on basically urban herbal gardens in polluted areas of Hanoi, and Miki Namba, who analyzed the difficulties and ultimate failure of rolling out solar-driven tuk-tuks in Luang Prabang and Vientiane in Laos. So just to flag that they do exist, and we're just sorry not everybody can talk today. But what I'll do is talk a little bit about some contexts and contrasts that have motivated this issue. It's basically a form of STS meets urban anthropology and urban studies in relation to Southeast Asian urban transformations. But today I would also like to say in relation to the urban Anthropocene more generally. And if we look at some contexts, I don't even need to read through this. I just wanted to put it up here. Pollution, gridlock, flooding, mudslides, dilapidated infrastructures, inequality, anger, housing, demographics. The list goes on and on. So on the one hand, much is happening at the intersection between political and ecological issues in big cities, not only in Southeast Asia, but across the world. At the same time, this is being analyzed in political ecology and urban studies, not so much in STS, but it's also at the same time turning into an increasingly central aspect or focus of what is known as Earth system science and socio-ecological systems thinking, that have indeed emphasized and pointed to 5 major types of global environmental change that are particularly related to urban megacities and their ecosystems. So the bottom quote here is from Grimm from 2008, not in Social Studies of Science or Science, Technology and Human Values, but rather in the Science Journal. And they end up with something that resonates very much with what we're talking about in this issue. urban systems as microcosms of changes that are happening globally for all kinds of reasons. So that's, so to speak, the global or planetary empirical context. Add to that then what I think is more distinctive about what we've been up to are some, what I would say today is some eclectic inspirations. On the one hand, from STS, where since 2010 with Ignacio Farias and Thomas Bender's urban assemblages, STS really began digging into urban issues and trying to develop a primarily action network theory inspired angle on thinking about urban issues, which was further developed with a more maybe Isabel Stenger's orientation in urban cosmopolitics by Anders Bloch and Ignacio in 2016. That intersects, to my mind, and with work that has been done more in the urban studies proper. For example, Worlding Cities by Roy Nong in 2011. And what we did in this issue, I think, is to stir in a bunch of other more sort of, what should we say, some curveballs or some odd angles to this already existing intersections. They came from places primarily in anthropology, Marilyn Strathern, partial connections, kaleidoscopes, fractals, Marisol de la Cadena and Mario Blazer's uncommons, and existing ongoing discussions in cultural theory and elsewhere of Asia's method via Takeuchi and Chen. So I want to just point to some very few contrasts here that I think exhibits the change, the change in orientation we've been exploring. A predominant one, back to Worlding Cities and urban cosmopolitics, is the distinction between cities as fundamentally, structurally or-determined sites. They can be or-determined in various ways, but a typical one would be via capital accumulation, neoliberalism, macro formations, where the topic then becomes disentangling and criticizing these or-determinations and the inequalities and precarities they generate, to cities as in an assemblage-like manner, never quite getting up to structure. As Deleuze would say in a different context, cities or structures as something that continue to work only by breaking down, colliding, clashing, creating frictions and fictions, and never really adding up to a whole. The second contrast would be with the more sort of liberatory rhetorics of the commons as an alternative to this or-determined side, the right to the city as a sort of liberatory space or agenda or aspiration, versus something that comes in via anthropology in particular as a thinking of uncommons, again with a nod to Mario and Marisol, or cosmoecology with a nod to Vinciane Desprez, series of not just uneven, but ontologically incongruent spaces, trying to figure out how to coexist, but without having any aspiration or belief in things adding up to something that anybody can have a right to, or that will be common to the inhabitants of cities. The third contrast is more particular to the phrase we use for this, material itineraries, and it is with urban metabolism, which is a term that's been receiving a lot of discussion in anthropology, but before that in industrial ecology and related intellectual formations, where the focus has been on flows of energy and materials so that cities could be thought of in analogy with human bodies on a macro scale. And the contrast here goes straight back to the uncommons and cosmoecologies mentioned just before, because the material itineraries and activity trails we're dealing with are relational packages that don't flow through a space, but are constructing and reconstructing both the space of cities and the things that are in cities, like humans and non-human subjects and objects, each of which are gaining different kind of specifications as they flow along and as the flows and itineraries collide with each other. So again, it's a matter of thinking in an STS-y kind of way beyond a distinction between subjects and objects, natures and cultures, to more entwined packages of relations that are in continual flux and transformation. As the final contrast test here, I would just say that I'll just comment on scale, which is such a big topic in anthropology, STS and elsewhere, and which is in fact also up here at the very top, cities as structurally overdetermined sites of capital accumulation at a macro scale. Because what we get from the vantage point that are created in the move we are exploring here is an alternative to that manner of thinking about scale. Instead of having micro scales appropriate to microsociologists and ethnographers who study face-to-face in communities in regional or institutional context, and then finally as part of macro formations like neoliberalism or settler colonialism, which is ultimately a container theory of a bunch of interacting levels, each of which has their own appropriate theory. Then what we get with material itineraries are scales as effects, constructed effects that are assembled and disassembled relationally through the movements of things and people in relation, which means that things can grow in scale and thereby gain reality, which means that worlds are at stake. But conversely, things can also lose scale when relational packages are disentangled, are torn apart, worlds are at stake again, but things can become smaller. Even what seems to be invincible structures can become smaller. The scales can be disassembled, as to say, with reference to Calonne and Latour, Paris can fall. So the final slide here is just a matter of pointing a bit forwards, at least to my mind. Urban critical zones is a term I've stolen from Latour and Weibel's critical zones, and they've translated that term from various geo-ecosciences. Without using it in exactly the same manner, I would now say that one way of thinking about this special issue of material itineraries is also for opening up for investigations of cities as observatories of emergent Anthropocene effects as urban critical zones and as experiments in tackling those effects. I think it's a matter of opening up for experimental forms of inquiry, again, that move freely across the nature-culture boundary in order to explore what shapes such critical zones, what makes them critical, and what happens within them once they're critical. And in turn, and as a final point, I would say that I think this opens up for a possible rethinking of critique itself as a matter of learning to make distinction in a context of crisis in urban critical zones, where things are increasingly combustible, that is, in a critical condition in Southeast Asia, but also across the world. So these were my words, and I'll stop and pass on to Jakrit.
All right, thank you very much, Casper, for the introduction, and also thank you East, and also like TransAsiaSTS and Deakin University for organizing this very interesting seminar. So I'm now going to share my slide. Okay, so my contribution to this special issue is a paper where I sort of spending time on myself, with the city called Bangkok, where I live, and the paper entitled "Bangkok Precipitated: Cloudburst, Sentient Urbanity, and the Emergent Atmosphere." So of course you can tell that I am interested in flood and rainfalls, especially in the city. So in this paper, I follow the material itineraries of the city multiplicity of assemblage. This is as my ethnographic method, And when I talk about material itinerary, I also employ the concept of material diagnostic. which is proposed by Hannah Knox, which she means that the effective engagement with the material environment that actually characterize people experience and in which has the effect of producing a rupture or a gap between the people's expectation and the actuality or the thing that actually happened. So when I look at the material diagnostics through the process of city assemblage during the precipitation time in Bangkok, I actually follow different kind of material movements ranging from the climatic precipitation, which is, we talk about cloud, we talk about humidity, we talk about heat, and also, the wind flow and everything. And from that climatic precipitation to the so-called political precipitation, which is the idea of how political articulation and expression of the people come together, which is also being driven by different kind of assemblage. For example, one of the key case study that I propose here is the perturbation of the cloudburst with different kind of infrastructures, with the people mobility and immobilities, and also the city atmosphere. So I propose that with this kind of precipitation through different assemblage, city become sentient, meaning that city is not a static space or relation or the built infrastructure alone, but because of the movement of materials and non-materials together has co-constituted several kinds of climatic effects and political articulation among people in the city. And this I use the concept of precipitation as a heuristic tool and a lens to actually illustrate the process of city becoming, which is I call the momentum of its multiplicity assemblage, has driven by the process of rain. So during the rain, during the cloudburst, what we see from the phenomenon is that a lot of cities' missing masses become very visible to the eye of the city dweller. And of course, with different kind of missing mass become visible. For example, we talk about the garbage that has been clogged underneath of the street. We talk about different materialities that has been hidden or invisible before and become very clear to the people in the street, on the street. So this kind of missing mass that become visible can act as a material catalyst to create a certain kind of feeling, especially irritation among the city dweller. So people become angry, people become irritated, and people become upset about different kind of things that has been hidden in the city itself. For example, we talk about the disjuncture between different infrastructural system. We talk about the immobility of transportation. We talk about the cleanliness of the city, and we talk about the inefficiency of the policy maker and implementation authority in dealing with the issue of flood and rain. So it become accumulated and turn the atmosphere of the city itself to something else. And when accumulated feeling, especially irritation, become strongly condensed, it couldn't go anywhere, because you are stuck with the rain, you are stuck with the disjuncture of the transportation and so on. So the only channel for people to express such irritation or angers is through social media. So I actually follow the itinerary of the materiality that has been, assembled in the situation of rain, and see how it actually drive the feeling or the atmosphere of the people, and then turn it to something else online. So, for example, you can see from this, very interesting picture from the Twitter that this is actually the time after the rain, and people are so exhausted, after work, and they try to get home, and they couldn't go anywhere because of the traffic has been stopped by the rain, and also with the flood in some area, and also people coming from the SkyTrain and then stop at the bus station and waiting for the bus to come. And it is not about the transportation or commute channel, but also it's about the weather. In Bangkok at that time, it's like so hot and humid and so wet that people are so annoyed with this kind of environment as well. So a lot of things has been going on at the same time that create certain kind of urban atmosphere. One of my key questions in this paper is that, as the rain comes, usually, Bangkok is very lively and bright city, but in a sudden, after the rain comes, the atmosphere of the urban turn dull and hectic. Why that happened? Why does this particular event happen, or why the atmosphere of Bangkok has been quickly transformed? Not even the first rain being dropped, but even the onset of the rain. So and this is a picture of Bangkok before the rain. So I look at different socio-ecological assemblage. I actually look at the multiple assemblage in this paper, but one is ecological assemblage, which trying to look at different aspects of the city altogether. For example, like geographical location of Bangkok itself, which is located in the Delta area, and also located in the tropical monsoon and rainfall climate area as well. Also, the process of urbanization, for example, the building of infrastructure, roads, the limitation of drainage system, and also the retention areas in the city. And all this together also related to the ecological events, for example, land sinking issues, seawater risings and coastal erosion. Altogether has created a socio-ecological assemblage that create a climatic precipitation in the city. This is the aerial map of Bangkok. So you can see that Bangkok is actually built upon the very soft clay of the Delta area, where the Chao Phraya River actually going down to the Gulf of Thailand. But another issue of another issue of assemblage is, I talk about the social ecological assemblage. I also look at the socio-technical assemblage, also look at how different infrastructure works or fail during the rain time. For example, I look at the new project called the Giant Drainage Tunnels, which is a project that has been implemented in Bangkok, and the aim is to solve the flood issue. But then it is not only about the single infrastructure that works in Bangkok, but it has to deal with different kind of network and the conjunction with other infrastructure as well. So socio-technical assemblage is also very important in looking at the phenomenon of precipitation in the city as well. So this is the picture of the giant tunnel has been built underground in Bangkok. And also the relation between the tunnel and other drainage system, and also its relation with other kind of infrastructure, for example, transportation, roads, and the building, and you know, the landscape of high-rise building as well. This is the picture of Bangkok, you know, when it rains. So you can see that literally a lot of like missing mass become visible to the eye of the people during the rain time. And the last assemblage that I actually explore in the paper is I call atmospheric assemblage, whereby, you know, the climate itself also create a series of events, the domino effect, that, you know, move, you know, from one aspect of assemblage into another kind of assemblage, you know, from the street to the digital platform, the social media, where people trying to express their anger and irritation toward the government and policy and authority. So I don't have much time. But what I would like to actually highlight here from the paper is that I trying to look at the effective perspective of material itinerary, that, for example, you know, as I already mentioned about different assemblage, Bangkok cloudburst actually create scenes, you know, where the entanglement and mutual perturbation of the ecologies, of the climate, of the city, you know, disjunctive infrastructure are clearly invisible. And with this, you know, as I already mentioned, I traced the trajectory from the climatic precipitation over perturbed atmosphere onto the political precipitation. So one of my argument in this paper is that, you know, rather than an individual or socio-psychological phenomenon, you know, irritated atmosphere appears as an effect of assemblage, and the city itself become distributed sentience that, you know, people all over the place in the city can share the same feeling of irritation driven by the climate and infrastructure failure. So urbanity itself is a very dynamic process in a sense that different, you know, or heterogeneous socio-natural entities, you know, ranging from transportation infrastructure to climate to digital media to infrastructure can converge and collide, and the city can become different, you know, in terms of characteristic, in terms of their atmosphere, in terms of their sentience, because the change of these, you know, human and non-human assemblage all together. So I think that would be my recap of the paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jackrit. And let's just quickly move on to Catherine's comment.
Yeah, thank you. I share my screen. Oops. Sorry. So it's a while ago that I presented online, obviously. I'm sorry. Try to figure out how to full screen it. Okay, otherwise I just let it like it is here at the moment. Sorry for that. Yeah, that's it. Okay, now I have it. Great. Okay, thank you everybody, and thank you for the patience now. Thank you for providing me space here to allow me to present my article and some of the insights I have elicited there. So it was about using matters infrastructures of waste management and emerging nature cultures in Phnom Penh. First of all, I like to I like quickly to introduce my research question and the methods. The whole endeavor actually was based on my PhD research. So some of these insights have been further developed in later days too. So, but the main arguments of this article were first that infrastructures are no linear sequences, nor do they have always a certain functionality under which they follow. And the second argument was that waste leakages as nature cultures enact different versions of the city. So mainly I was very reversely to check it, interested in how materials constitute and create something that is somehow stable. Which corresponds to the leading question that was, how is the recycling infrastructure on site enacted, shaped and maintained, and how is the city transformed and redesigned? In this regard, I was following the material itineraries, but while following the materials for especially recyclable waste, I realized that these are very much social materials. And in this regard, I was especially looking on materialization processes. So I would rather say that I was following materialization's itineraries. As I said, it was based on my PhD research. So I have done a lot of qualitative interviews, participant observation, mental maps, and something like that are later called cyclic following, which I explain later onwards. So the whole topic was situated in Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia. And the city is described that it was somehow a starting point as having a serious waste problem and as a city of garbage. In this regard, only the solid waste sector is formalized. However, 1/3 of the overall waste consumption are recyclables. So the functioning so-called informal recycling economy is quite well functioning, and it's very genuine as it consists of approximately 3,000 waste pickers, so-called HIs, intermediaries, depot owners, and different other actors that succeed in transporting the recyclables through the whole value chain until it's sent off abroad. So at the moment, the situation is that there are ongoing political negotiations of the partly formalization of the sector and the implementation of a circular economy model. So that is somehow the background of the whole research. So the circularity of social materialities was something I was especially look on. In this regard, the Guinea recycling infrastructure is a bottom-up build and, in this sense, a collaborative network, according to Simon and Larkin. And in this regard, I argue that it is a lived infrastructure. Contrary to often top-down erected infrastructure, the recycling infrastructure was not determined to a certain functionality or purpose, as it is often the case, for example, for hard infrastructures or for service-related infrastructure. So I was mainly interested in showing and eliciting in how far or how an infrastructure is, so what constitutes it, what holds it in place in time and renders it eventually stable. In this regard, I draw back to Kubernetic theories. After I realized that through an ethnographic research, I realized that the materials and the practices are crucially in understanding how certain things, as assemblage but differently, are held together, so in kind of a form like an infrastructure, for example. So the Kubernetic perspective on circularities brought me to a different starting point, where I could understand how things could be stable and maintained. In this regard, I was referring, for example, to Maturana and Varela, who says that living systems work under a certain idea of self-referentiality and autopoiesis. That is, that they always try to hold themselves stable. I was mixing this or merging that with Gregory Bateson's idea of difference that make it different. That means that every change informs the system. in this regard, I was somehow equalizing system and infrastructure, even though there are some pitfalls in this comparison. So my main point was, and that is what I extracted from the Kubernetes ideas of circularity, that one should focus on processes, not only on things. And this additionally circumvents the presupposition of casual linear mechanisms that at the same time overcomes human and non-human boundaries, as well as material and social boundaries too. I understand in this regard the recycling practices, for example, on site as deeply social material practices. So at the whole heart of my analysis at the end were not the materials on their own, but the practices, the social material practices of recycling. And that brought me to think about how it eventually holds up the whole recycling infrastructure. In this way, circularity is an underlying precondition under which the recycling infrastructure works and sustains. The cyclic following and tracing of materials and practices as social material or materializations itineraries unravel the infrastructure as fragmented by many infracycles. So as I quoted it direct from my article, these are social material constellations through which the quotidian flows of persons, goods, tools, and narratives and ideas are organized in a circular manner that were functioning as an actual lived infrastructure. So that means, as such, they come into being through recurrent, repetitive, and recursive practices, as these practices always refer to themselves and to the structure they are belonging somehow, of different actors and boundary materials, like waste, embedded in political, social, and high historical circumstances and interplays. However, and that was the second argument, of course, materials also ooze out from a relative ordered space of infracycles and also models, and transform the city as an emergent nature culture from elsewhere. So on this picture, for example, you see one of the sewage channels, which is obviously very polluted by waste, but this is only what we see at the moment, because what you can imagine is that you see on a picture the clouds, for example. So the whole water is quite dark already. That means that waste has become so much fragmented and became so much departed in little particles that emerge in something that is very, very visibly nature culture and not nature minus culture anymore. So the in-place hybridity of urban nature cultures provoke different versions and visions of the city. And it also elicits the limits of the models and of the infrastructure, as I already said. So to conclude, and to come back also to Kasper's introduction. So rapid transformation and urban redesigns are effect of material itineraries, according to Kasper. So what I have found out is that there are also purposeless infrastructure that exists through circular practices in moving materials. And that in this regard, that is not so much new. Infrastructure is a practice and a process. Following these material itineraries does allow to understand urban redesign through emergent nature cultures and urban transformation from below. It also helps to understand urban stability in general. And Joshua Barker, for example, referred in his commentary in the special issue to the concept as something that allows the analyst to be something like a flaneur of actor networks moving through time and space. And actually, I would rather say it's, for my case, it's not the analyst, but it's the ethnographer, to be something like a flaneur of different practices moving through time and space, which actually defines it more than a method than an approach, which is also which I also like to draw back to Kasper's introduction, that is Asian cities as a method. It means to descend to the West, but it also means that following material itineraries can be a decolonial approach that grasps situations beyond ontonormative and Western-induced classification of critique, something also Kasper said in the introduction, when I like to finally quote him again. When it comes to urban transformation, the issues are not encompassed by the conventional categories and targets of critique, such as capitalism, neoliberalism, or imperialism. Every urban site is an effect of flows in relation, activity traits, and material itineraries with propensities that overflow space and undermine intention. And I think that is a crucial point, and also the opportunity that material itineraries provide as a decolonial approach, and maybe also as a kind of ethnographic method. And at the end, I really like to take the chance to make some advertisement for the book, which is forthcoming. It's about recycling infrastructure in Cambodia. And a lot of the insights that I presented and demonstrated in the article in the special issue are also included in this book. So it's forthcoming, and the first introduction is also open access. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine, and also Jacqueline for the author's comment. And now we are going to move to our readers. We would be like to see how our readers, what they thought of reading all these articles, including Jacqueline's and Catherine's and the 3 other articles. So we're going to start with Fajar Ibn Tufail. So Fajar, please give your comment. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Gary. First of all, I'd like to thank for the invitation to contribute to be in this very interesting seminar. But before I begin, I should also begin some disclaimer that I'm not an urban specialist, but I'm an anthropologist. So I think most of my comments will not be dealing with this urban theorizing, anything, mostly in terms of how we look at this issue in a more broader way. And I think one of the most important point that I'd like to raise is that this idea, and actually written by Casper in his introduction, is actually connecting to very closely to the problem in area studies, because I'm mostly working on area studies work, so I will like to start from that aspect. And especially when we're talking about the something X as method, then the next question will be, how do we reconcile that kind of method with the STS theorizing? So here, what I like to point out is that one very important point made by Takeuchi and also Quan Xingpeng in his book Asia as Method, that this is kind of a connection or probably what he called kind of a transnational connect. It's actually a process of affective interreferencing. I think this is one thing that also being discussed in all of these article and so when I was reading all of the article, and that just kind of reminds me of the Indonesian cities, and you can find the same problem, the same situation in many of big Indonesian cities. And this is, I think, one of the example how this process of affective interferencing is taking place. Because I feel the same way, I feel the frustration, I feel the anger, I feel also kind of uh, challenge in how to deal with, for example, if I want to build a new house in Jakarta, for example, I have to deal with some processes of negotiating with not only with the Chinese developer but also with the local thugs and so forth. So this is the problem that I think not only very strongly conveyed in all of the article, but also it becoming some sort of the point where we can raise the problem of this what the Asia studied method effective referencing. So this is one thing that STS actually can contribute by more kind of dissecting more what and um, Casper already detailed in his introduction that the problem with affect interference, and actually it stops within the realm of imagination. And now by looking at more STS work, then we can kind of put the material dimension of this imagination, something that I see as a very strong contribution of this either both to the STS scholarship, but also to area studies work. So then I kind of would like to talk a little bit on several common and several important issue that I found in article in that edited editions. The first one is the notion of the sympathetic effect that Jakrit also mentioned, and then putting out that again it is something that is not only happening in Bangkok but also happening in Jakarta during the rain. So the question is then, how do we kind of regard or talk about this sympathetic affect as a kind of political, political effect. And then I think this is the problem where every context of every political context contribute different kinds of kind of ways of putting the assembly. Because what happened in Bangkok probably will be slightly different with what happened in Jakarta, but at the same time it's also similar because it's kind of this interreferencing process brought by the same kind of ecological condition, Anthropocene problem, and so forth. But there are some kind of different ways of dealing with this assemblies that I will later on I will show in using some graphic illustration and what happened in Jakarta. So, but what is really interesting for me reading the statement, the in Jacket's article when talking about the the the, the politician talking about water waiting to seep into the soil, and it reminds me that the Indonesian governor, Jakarta's governor, also at some point said that when he was criticized by because of the flood, and then he said, well, God wants water to go directly into the soil, not drain through the tunnel. So this is same kind of attitude for me very interesting to compare. When the government, the Jakarta government, was asked whether he would like to kind of build a big tunnel under Jakarta in order to help drain the water, and what he responded is that they said that God wants water to go directly into the soil, not drain through the tunnel. So this is for me it's kind of in one way it's also interesting because and there is a new dimension of assemblies that came up uh, at this particular moment that incorporate this kind of religious sentiment, and this is something that I was kind of looking in the article, but it seems that the somehow if this a new component or new elements of assembly can be put into also action, that will be very very interesting to see to what extent, for example, like from Phnom Penh and also Cambodian city with many lots of Buddhist community, and also compared to, for example, Jakarta, in which, dominated by Muslim community, and the way how this play out, that will be very very interesting, at least from my uh, uh, point of view. So then another thing that I have found it very interesting in the article, and especially the notion of the concept of opacity that um, as per this article, that this is actually the opacity of the Chinese. It's somehow for me it's connected to the way how the political context, and especially look at the opacity not only in terms of the ethnic opacity but also in terms of political opacity in the sense like for example like the in many of the cases presented in the article, the state becomes a kind of a generic and also abstract category. So it's not only the Chinese, but also the state itself become opaque, and it becomes the generic and abstract category. And this is probably also connected to some one way or another questions of urban violence, in which most of the problem, urban problem, has a violent dimension in it. I think if we can also put that into assemblies, the notion of the violence and state opacity, then I think the picture that presented here can be very much becoming much more interesting. Um, okay, so then the last thing that I would like to discuss here is that the yeah, I think Catherine already mentioned that when Joshua points out that some of the itineraries tend to follow the predictable path, and due to the wider critical positions of the researchers when they examine and they analyze the project. But I think it seems that this critical take on the problem of the urban context has some kind of layerings that some of the layering has been discussed quite convincingly, but there is also some of the layering that are not really that is important but needs to be addressed in a more kind of explicit way. That is the role of the scientist and the technocrat. And I think uh, the article by Gergely also mentioned about this the role of ethnobotanical and ecological action. But in referring to the situation in Indonesia, that the scientists and also the technocrats, especially those working at my institution, the National Institute of Research and Innovation Agency, uh, they have a very much a strong position in terms of how uh, 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 shaping this kind of a process of material itineraries, and especially in the context of national policy and national idea of what constitutes the proper scientific take, for example, uh, urban problem and also problem. So this is something that is waiting to be explored in more detail. Okay, and then The probably one last thing that I like to mention here is that the way I think the best way of dealing with the concept of material itineraries, uh, I think perhaps the best way of doing that is starting with the possibility of the assemblage itself. So in the notion of the openness of the potential assemblage, because the assemblage is always like a, probably you're familiar with this kind of Arthurian take on the assemblage, that it never it always becoming potential. So it is never becoming something that is there, but it's always in the middle. It's always becoming potential. So in that sense, probably, for example, that the oozing of the leakage that is identified in Catherine's work, perhaps it's not a leakage, but potential or a new becoming of. This is something that is, we can kind of exercise, and in putting that assembly as a potential, then there is a possibility always different elements coming into play, different material element coming into play into it. That make assemblage probably in Jakarta it probably similar or different from the one in Bangkok, in Cambodia or Phnom Penh. Okay, so let me show the last one. Let me show one thing. One, two slides. So here's the okay. So I have two slides to illustrate my last point. That it seems when reading this the book, it comes to my mind is the problem is somehow I feel that it is indeed serious problem, but there are some kind of overlooked dimension in terms of if you are talking about affect. It is not always somehow suppressing, depressing, and something. Yes, there is that kind of affect, but in Indonesian case, we can also talk about kind of a playful fact that emerging out of this all of the whole problem, the floods and everything. We look at this is how the people responded to the Jakarta flood. They made they made several funny memes, like for example like this one. This is comparing Jakarta during the flood with the Toba Lake and the Kuta Bali. People enjoying the water using the water scooter. But here, in Jakarta, the situation is different. Also, in the other pictures, you can see when talking about America, Russia, you have very sophisticated submarine technology, but here in Jakarta, you have this like so it's kind of a for me playful response to the very serious problem. And then like this one, you have the banjir. I will take care of that. Then you have here a Kamen Rider. As you see that one of the superheroes, Japanese superheroes. So, and then the other one. This is that something that I mentioned earlier in my comments, that religion become a very important elements of assemblage. And here you can see this is the governor of Jakarta, Anies Baswedan, and this he uh, it's this person asked the governor, "Sir, what is the solution to overcome the flood?" And what the governor said, praying. While at the same time, you have a flood already coming, uh, and Jakarta is already flooded. So this is one of the kind of very different ways of putting effect into us that is not always sometimes it's also playful, but the other one is, you can say that the kind of a religious effect also probably plays a very important role in constitution. Yes, I think that's it from me, and thank you so much.
Fajar, thank you very much. I think we will have enough time later to come back to the points that you raised here, so thank you. And we are going to move to our recorded discussant, Iti Abraham. Nachana, do you have the video ready? Thank you.
I want to begin by acknowledging that I thoroughly enjoyed reading the essays in this special issue. I learned a lot from them, not least for the working through of both novel concepts and concepts deployed in novel ways, including nature cultures, infracycles, environmental public health, and probably most intriguing of all, the idea of irritated atmospheres. Due to the lack of time and local expertise, I prefer not to comment on each article directly. Hence, I've chosen in these brief comments to develop some of the themes highlighted in the introductory essay that Kasper Brun Jensen has titled Material Itineraries. I see these remarks as a chance to reflect on the possibilities of STS as a means to understand urban spaces, to understand what is both different and distinctive about the Asian city, and to understand the urban experience through an Asian frame. This is what makes this collection important and useful in my mind, and why I think it is important to begin a conversation using these materials. Hopefully my remarks will help listeners put this collection in further context and to point to areas where more scholarly collaboration would be most productive. That said, I want to begin in South Asia rather than Southeast Asia. Not in the future, but in the past and in the present. I begin with Muhammad bin Tughlaq, Sultan of Delhi in the early 12th century. Tughlaq, who was described by contemporaries as a deeply secular man and rationalist, with a good understanding of philosophy, mathematics, and medicine, is largely forgotten these days, except for a single notorious episode during his reign. He is said to have ordered the entire population of Delhi, the capital of the Sultanate, to move to a new capital, Daulatabad or Devgiri, which was to become the new center of his kingdom. The new capital was 1,000 kilometers away, and the journey was taken during the hot summer months. Many of the migrants died in the process in spite of its systematic efforts to ease their journey. Less than a decade later, for a variety of reasons, he ordered the people of Delhi to return home, confirming that the decision was a huge mistake. In fact, and notwithstanding popular memory, not all of Delhi was forced to move. It was mainly the elites of the city, including learned men, Sufis, and nobles, who were encouraged to move to the new capital. Since they had the most to lose in the process, not surprisingly, the historical record reflects this decision as a great folly, characteristic of a megalomaniacal mind, which is how we remember Tughlaq today. Coming to the present, some of you will be aware that the administrative center of New Delhi is today going through a major transformation. Under the Modi government, a new parliament and a new axis of state buildings is being built at the cost of no less than 2 billion euros. Buildings are being torn down, the integrity of the original Lutyens design lost, part of the National Archives are being demolished, and this whole project was begun at a time when COVID was running rampant through the country and Delhi was competing with Beijing for the title of most polluted city in the world. New symbols are being created representing a more aggressive and belligerent India, while new names are being given to old roads and places in the name of finally putting to rest the colonial history of the nation's capital. The architectural team was chosen by executive decision and unsurprisingly was awarded to a crony of the current PM. This firm is already much reviled by heritage experts for what they have done both in Ahmedabad, where Modi comes from, and Varanasi, Modi's parliamentary constituency. As the sculptor Anish Kapoor has written, This project is Modi's way of placing himself at the center and cementing his legacy as maker of a new Hindu India. A new capital is coming into being based on the fantasies of a new Tughlaq, but with a difference. With Modi, it is impossible to ignore that the primary reference points of this enormous project are focused on an imagined and glorious pre-colonial past, not the future. I want to return to these images a little later. Let me now turn to the introduction. The most important claim being put forward via its engagement with a variety of literatures from urban studies to STS is that the Asian urban is always an outcome, not a fixed and permanent condition. The Asian city, and indeed perhaps all cities, is always becoming, notwithstanding its outward appearance of fixity and permanence. This is a challenging conclusion and may come as a surprise to those stuck in Jakarta's endless traffic jams or their equivalent in Bangkok, but an eminently sensible conclusion when placed in the wide frame offered by the introduction. This is, in other words, a very post-structural conclusion. Indeed, a disinclination to foreground big structures is a central element of the discussion. Cities, Jensen argues, are made simultaneously from above and below, with competing visions operating at different scales. Cities are constantly redesigning themselves according to multiple scripts that are incongruent, competing, and even bypassing each other. Asian cities look to each other in a hierarchy of gazes, even as they intersect with global regimes of capital and political hegemony. Drawing on the work of scholars such as Ananya Roy, Iwa Ong, Ignacio Farias, and Anders Bloch, it is proposed that cities are constituted by multiple intersecting heterogeneous assemblages, including material agencies, socio-political assemblies, and psychic and climatic atmospheres, all of which come together unequally and unevenly to make the urban outcome. The articles in this issue begin from and develop these themes, drawing on a familiar STS repertoire that blurs the boundaries between the living and the inanimate, between nature and culture, thus producing a rich account of resulting assemblages across urban spaces in different parts of Southeast Asia. The journeys in material itineraries are conditions of and symptomatic of the Asian urban. They include rural to urban migration, which brings young men and women to the primate city. They include also the increasing resort to gated and ethnically homogeneous communities, which seek to channel and discipline passage through securitized corridors. Another movement are the natural and geological effects that lead to sinking cities, which in turn generate corresponding fantasies of starting afresh in a new location. Travels include uncontrolled movements of waste and excess, involving not just people, but also cement and water, which joins with climatic change to provide increasingly unlivable atmospheres. The desire to move to the city is confronted by the remorseless demand to remain in the city and for the city to remain where it is, producing a dialectic that ends up making futures with no single author and where no one can pinpoint how the outcome was determined. The introduction resists the idea that urban transformation can be reduced to big structures: capitalism, neoliberalism, imperialism. While most of us would happily endorse a ban on overused and underspecified terms such as neoliberalism, it is hard not to notice that for all their variety, it is the same set of communities that are typically on the receiving edge of transformation when the urban dust has settled. The informal, illegible, and impermanent zones of slums, swamps, alleys, rubbish dumps, and other liminal spaces are noticeable by their absence. By the same token, when we read about an ontology of transformation without endpoint, we do not also encounter to the same extent the ontology of insecurity that comes from the constant threat of displacement and removal, another kind of mobile itinerary. Big structures may be problematic as explanations for everything, but it's hard not to notice that the majority of urban transformations affect the same demographic, marginal and informal communities, giving weight to another familiar term today, precarity. Even as climate change promises to affect everyone within an urban space, somehow that is rarely the outcome that we come to see. What could have been emphasized more is the need for closer attention to and comparisons between the uneven and unequal transformations of Asian urban spaces, where class difference is written into material change by making modern architecture and futuristic urban planning alibis for the deployment of bulldozers and land reclamation. Global chains of value are produced, it cannot be forgotten, through the remaking of space in pretty much the same way everywhere. Material Itineraries draws inspiration from Chen Kuan-Sing's Asia as Method, a book that seeks liberation from different kinds of empire. It proposes that we may now be able to imagine the Asian city as method through a focus on material itineraries without falling into Chen's obsession with the political structures of domination. While that is indeed one aspect of this well-known study, there are other elements of his discussion that get less attention, somewhat surprisingly. I refer, of course, to Chen's Inter-Asia project, which breaks with the imperial and educational division of Asia into South, Southeast, and East Asia, rejecting their representation as discrete regions with their own history and essence. For Chen, the separation of regions within Asia has led to a theoretical and political cul-de-sac by foreclosing the possibility of learning from the experience of other Asian countries. He traces other geographies of interaction, notably from Taiwan to India, thereby giving new energy to the post-colonial project by foregrounding a politics of progressive change. Inter-Asia, it could be argued, is the most successful practical outcome of the Asia as Method project, helping to build new bridges and restore old connections that had long made Asia a space of cross-cultural networks and circulation. If we take this aspect of Asia as Method seriously, we need to ask, why is it so important to retain Southeast Asia as a qualifier for urban transformations, and what might in fact be lost by not comparing Phnom Penh and Bangkok to Dhaka, Colombo, Dushanbe, and Tashkent, a more immediate form of lateral comparison. Drawing attention to the limits of natural boundaries and reinforcing the scale of the urban permits us to also to recast labor migration as transnational labor diasporas, opening up novel urban intersections with rural spaces across Asia. It is in this light that my opening comments on Mohammed bin Tughlaq and Narendra Modi as urban disruptors may make more sense. The introduction of material itineraries begins with Jakarta sinking slowly into the ground and a new capital for Indonesia being planned. We are reminded that Sukarno similarly had imagined a new capital for Indonesia and Kalimantan, even though his project never came to pass. But this is not just an Indonesian story. It is truly a pan-Asian one. Newly independent Bangladesh and Pakistan, lack of resources and the trauma of partition notwithstanding, built new capital cities and government complexes as a way of making a break with the past, as did, for very different reasons, North Korea. East Timor did the same once independence was achieved, as did Myanmar, albeit to deny the changes that democracy movements had wrought. Kazakhstan's capital was moved from Almaty to Astana. Its name has just been changed from Nur Sultan back to Astana. What I'm getting at is that for all the apparent novelty of a new capital city, it is an old and familiar Asian plotline. If the urban is the scale we want, and we do, then Southeast Asia no longer works as a boundary marker. The urban itself becomes the unit for comparison, even if we cannot always fix its boundaries. If Asia as Method does anything, it rejects the colonial spatial divisions that have divided India in the past and present. Rethinking urban transformations should therefore not become an alibi for returning to those discredited divisions. Moreover, and this is a more disturbing problem, these examples suggest that the dominant Asian urban imaginary may be less a reflection of or a claim to a technologically sophisticated future that is just around the corner, the Singapore story in a nutshell, but rather a return to hyper-national fantasies steeped in an imaginary past, reinforcing class divisions, ethnic hierarchies, and racial inequalities. Without question, this is a vision stripped of the urban jouissance, to invoke Walter Benjamin, that is the starting point for the centuries-old movement of especially Asian men to the big city. It is an uncomfortable conclusion, but in the end, the big structures of authoritarian discipline, joined with the latest technologies of control, intersecting with the movements of Chinese capital, may be what marks Asian urban difference distinctively. What is less determinate and what truly marks the future is what nature may decide. And that overwhelming vector of movement operates on an entirely different scale and temporality altogether. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Idi. He might be following this from YouTube if he's not fallen asleep, I don't know, because he's very late, I guess. But also thank you, all of you, for the comments and both authors and discussants. And can I ask those of you who are here, authors and readers, to switch your camera on, and we are going to use this remaining 30 minutes to have a discussion. We have probably enough thoughts, food for thought for more than an hour, but we only have 30 minutes, so we are going to be probably strict with time. So let's just jump in and start the conversation. We have a couple of questions from guests, but or the audience, but let's start with reflecting on each other's comments, if I may ask. Casper, can you kick it off?
Well, I can try. It's always very, as they say, challenging with a bunch of presentations and really great comments. Thank you, Fajar, and thank you, virtual Iti. So there's so much going on. So indeed, what to say? I think what I should say, because there are other things that were more specifically related to Jakrit and Catherine's papers and some of their ideas. I also saw there was at least a specific question to Catherine in the chat, but some of what Iti was talking about related to what he saw as the interests and also the kinds of problems that are there in the material itineraries formulations as I produce them, which Catherine and Miki and you and Jakrit are not responsible for. So maybe I can use 2 minutes on that. I mean, it's of course an almost conventional schism between systems and structural thinkers, and then those E.T. called them post-structuralists, who are inclined to break up things, right? So assemblage, STS, deconstruction, whatever it is, so that the opening move from somebody like me, who tends to the latter, will be to say, well, I mean, it's not going to add up to a full structure, and then pursue that line, and then somebody like Edie will come in and say, yes, but however, things are yet precarious. It's in patterned ways. It's uneven. It's in patterned ways. How can you just pretend that kind of thing is not happening? And there is a systematicity to it. So I mean, so that kind of discussion is obviously recurrent. I mean, for me, I think the excess method. Fajar also mentioned that in the beginning. What I found very interesting in playing with that was that it might be possible to say, instead of looking at Asia as method as this kind of diffuse project of potentially anti-hegemonic subject formation, if Asian people were able to let go of their sort of various complexes with relation to Euro-American people, if instead of locating that as a sort of process of psychic liberation that is yet in a certain sense made almost impossible since we are indeed within an or-determining structure a pyramid scheme of sorts with Western countries up top, and then in Chen's book, like China, Japan, and lower than that, Vietnam, and lower than that, Laos and Cambodia. If we could drop the pyramid to begin with, maybe the possibilities for the kind of outcome, the sort of liberation in some sense, would be enhanced rather than reduced. And what would that mean from an STS point of view then? For me, that would mean that the kind of worlding that is involved in that, now I'm tying it in with, I think, Yuti's question, which was in the chat box, asking about worlding Asia as method, relating, Yuti said, to worlding as he or she understood it via Anat Singh, and how that fit with Edward Said or did not fit. I'm just reading aloud because I guess people can't see it on YouTube. So then I would say that, well, the kind of worlding that is at stake, if you're an sort of STS anthro person of my sorts with an interest in ontological things, that would be a kind of worlding that is not subject formations within structures, but is rather composites that come together and shape things that may or may not be able to break free, create a mini event and break free from something that seems very stable right now. And so that fits well, Yuji, with Anat Singh's worlding. That is the same as that. And it is different from Edward Said, who I have a lot of sympathy for, in a certain sense, the project, but I would locate that in the same sense as the Asia as method of, in a certain sense, fixating too much on the hegemonic structures, in a way, analyzing them in such a way that you're talking them up, ascribing to them more power, and in a certain sense, creating less agency and possibility for change, because the analysis of why they're invincible and why things are always bound to go the same way is so powerful that in a certain sense you tie your own hands. And I feel that is perhaps the problem I have with Chen there, and those discussions in general, including with the remarks on precarity from Iti, that it is not that these things are not going on, and it's not that outcomes are not uneven. It is that we know this extremely well. We may not agree totally on why that is the case, but we know it extremely well, and we can know it so well that we effectively disable ourselves from the possibilities of, I think this was Fajar's term, activating other potentialities, of knowing other things might also be possible. And I would connect that with Isabel Stenger's, the notion of taking care of the possible against the probable, so that where the probable is, things are indeed as they are. People in poor conditions get nothing. They are more harshly affected. The detrimental effects always go in their direction, and the richer gets richer. Indeed, that is the case, and that is the probable. But if you want to go beyond that observation towards a kind of inquiry into the possibility of something else, speculative propositions for different urban Anthropocene, then I guess you have to take care of the possible. And that must mean talking up the possibility of other things still being able to happen. So I think that's how it's a kind of, there's a speculative gambit to that. So I would say that it's not so much that this ontology of transformations that Iti is talking about, with transformation without endpoint, that it is bound to neglect that many of the ontological transformations are destructive, because they are. We know that. It is that some of them could not be destructive, and we're not yet sure. And so there's a collective demand, I would say, there should be a collective demand for figuring out what are the possibilities for transformations of undestructive kinds, which is not to neglect the others. I think that's what it is. And the last thing, and I'll really not say any more in this session here, is that I think where that is marked in Iti's comment is that he says, if I heard it correctly, things are operating at different scales. We're looking at multiple intersections between many different kinds, from climates to socio-political unrest to this and that, and they kind of meet each other. That is, their scales, and they intersect. And yes, that's almost, I think, what I wrote, but not entirely, because the emphasis was that the scales aren't there. They are being made and unmade. They do not meet there. And the domains aren't there, so that the climate isn't there and the socio-political isn't there. It is an emergent effect of the relations. Asia isn't there. Asian cities aren't there. They are emergent effects. What is a climate today, in that it creates the necessity for certain capitals to change location within the next 20 years? What is a subject in a city now who will have to respond to these kinds of things? And indeed, I mean, what is an economy? What is a circular economy? What is an irritated atmosphere? All of these things are emergent effects, and it's because they're emergent effects that can have stable long-term outcomes, but it's because they're emergent effects that it's possible for them to be something different than they are. So they are all the bad things, they're precarity generating and so forth. But as Marisol de la Cadena would say, they're not only that. And so it's the not only that becomes the issue in tracing what's going on with material itineraries. What could a subject be that is affected adversely in many ways by climate change, but yet could also turn into something different? What would that be? And I think this is the intra-Asia that Iti ended with is really interesting there for the lateral to lateral comparisons and connections of allowing people to look. Now I said Marisol, so let's say look to the Andean mountains and the Quechua peasants she's working with, from there to the slum dwellers of Klong Toy in Bangkok. Now that's a very interesting comparison potentially for learning what subjects could be under severely changing conditions where nobody knows what's going on. And I think that is made possible if you undo the notion that Asia as a method is always something that has to pass back through the center of the strong adversary of the Euro-Americans, which is what I think Said and Chen at their moments had to do, but I don't necessarily think Fajar and Jakrit and Marisol and people everywhere else have to do it today. And I think material itineraries speak into that conversation. So, yeah.
Thank you, Casper. Yuti, just a moment. You can, of course, reflect on the answer of Casper, because this was partly also an answer to a question that we had on Zoom. And for those of you on YouTube, I think the question itself from Yuti is posted on YouTube as well. So you can go back and look at the question. So Yuti, do you want to respond or answer to Casper?
No, I think it's a kind of like you kind of like take the word out of my brain, because I'm thinking, is it adding like an additional layers to these discussions? Because by proposing, oh, this is like an Asian method, we have like a different name, and then we start to really trying to create like a distinction, and this is the West, this is the East. But then I think like the way I understand like worlding is really going to the fields, and then you really try to understand what's going on, and there's these itineraries. So yeah, I mean, like the answer is just like perfect, so I don't have anything else to add. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuti. How about the other comment authors and readers here on Zoom? I mean, we still have questions from the floor, but just in case you want to reflect on this or anything else. Anyone, just feel free. I'm not going to point to anyone.
Maybe I can jump in a little bit.
Yeah. Thank you,
well, thank you very much, Fajar and Iti, for your very thoughtful comments. I think there are some small issue that I would like to sort of engage with what you have mentioned, both in terms of the precarity, you know, in the urban living, and also the political action that has, you know, been driven and emerged from the sentient urbanism. Of course, I mean, living in the urban, you know, area, people are not only encounter precarity or precariousness alone, but of course they are also, on the other side, there are also like preoccupation, meaning that people are so busy with many things, even though they are so precarious, you know, meaning that everything is so insecure. But it doesn't mean that people have a lot of time or space, to actually voice out their concern. And I think Casper mentioned about the right to the city at the beginning of his introduction. Also, we can use the idea that ETA has proposed about the city as a unit of comparison, or lateral comparison instead of demarcation, as a point of comparison between, for example, like you mentioned about Jakarta and Bangkok as well. So I think one other thing that we can learn from this is that when we talk about the right to the city, it is it might be very different from place to place, right? Of course, people participation in promoting or in claiming their right to the city might be different. And in this case, as I mentioned about the precarity and preoccupation, people in Bangkok are so preoccupied by different things. Even though they encounter a lot of precarity, they might not be able to come out and voice their concern that much. So the idea of material itineraries, or the idea of material diagnostics allow us to see that people start to be aware of the situation. So it is a matter of fact turning into a matter of concern, to use the tour's idea, that people start to concern about their precarity once they has been encountered with different kind of atmosphere or the material encounter through this kind of assemblage. So of course, I think this is quite crucial, especially for me, because when we talk about the right to the city and participation, it's not a universal set of idea, but using Asia or the city as a method allow us to see the distinctiveness of this kind of political action from different contexts as well.
Yeah, thank you, Jakrit. I think you also kind of ended your comment with either Asia or the CTS method, and I think it was one main issue in both Fajar's and Iti's comments. But I don't know if anyone else has something to comment on this or something else, or we can also move to questions from the floor if you like. Fajar?
Yeah,
Catherine?
I have a comment, actually, one short comment. This is my problem with this XS method, that actually it tends to put the process that they call it interreferencing process in a lateral position. I'm just kind of thinking it's possible. I don't know, but this is kind of a experimental kind of probably not so experimental, but also perhaps thinking in terms of kind of what I call the kind of how do you put it? The pulse of itinerary. There's kind of a pulsating moment when sometimes up and then sometimes down. And then if you talk about the kind of XS method, and if, for example, in my own work, when I'm talking about this kind of C as a method, we can look at the material itinerary, material processes, material movement, mobilities from port to port is something that is pulsating. In some port, then there is probably there is a moment where all the material coming together and forming the assemblage, because there is there are ships coming to the port, and but at the same time there is also the kind of moment where the port is empty, nobody is there, especially we're talking about this port in the eastern part of the Indonesian city. And then you can see there is some kind of a moment where there is a trend or material up and down. So this is kind of a thing that probably, I mean, Deleuze also mentioned about this kind of pulsating moment of the musical score, for example. And then I think I'm not sure about if you're talking about the city, especially those are we are talking mostly here. This is a big city, right? Bangkok, Jakarta, in one way or another. This is but how about if we're talking about the small kind of city located in a very remote part of Indonesia, for example, in eastern part of Indonesia, and what kind of method that can we are talking about this? It's kind of a thing that always come to my mind, and sort of trying to uh, uh, put this in the idea of X as method, because we're talking about city as method, and here we're talking about mostly big cities, Jakarta, and but how about the kind of small cities, and even speculative city like the new capital of Indonesia. So um, I'm not sure whether you have any kind of response to this.
Thank you, Fajr. I think Katrin raised her hand, so I'd like to give her the word, and then we have two more questions from the floor that I also want to address. So, yeah. So I think Katrin, and then the questions from the floor.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, I just want to come back to this question in the chat. So from Lai Fernley, if I pronounce it correctly. So he's
Katrin,
asked,
I'm sorry.
yeah?
Sorry, Katrin, to interrupt. If you respond to Lila's question, let me just shortly introduce it, and then it's easier to.
Okay, all right, yeah.
Because
Then
not everyone can. I probably
I
everyone can
wanted
read.
to read it out loud, but you can also do it.
Yeah, let's do so. Yeah.
Okay, so he's asking, how does my concept of infracycles and its socio-ecological respective kybernetic circularity differ from discourse of circular economy, which are increasingly dominant in places like Singapore? So yeah, thank you for that question. That directs me to a point which I have emphasized in the presentation, also not so much in this article, but which is a topic of my forthcoming book, for example. Yeah. So the point is that the circular economy model is a model, and my concept is a concept, and rather I would even say it can be a kind of theory. So theories or concepts is rather try to explain certain underlying mechanisms, whereas the model is rather the representation of a envisioned reality, I would say. So in the regards to, especially to the circular economy model. So the circular economy model strives for the nearly perfect circulation of materials, in this regard, for example, waste, that loops from the beginning of the birth of waste until its end of life, as it's often said in waste management jargons. So what the theory or the concept of infracycle does is actually not to look on materials but on practices, especially to highlight and emphasize that practices are the things, makes the things stable and renders them in kind of functional somehow. So the point is that infracycles can shed light on how circular economy models could be extended. That is the point, that is linkage I wanted to make, insofar as it is worthwhile not to look on the material side only, but to take practices into consideration too. So that is actually a relationship that can be brought up somehow. But despite these, the model and the concept of infracycles are quite diverse. I hope that explains it somehow.
Yes, thank you, Katrin. Then it's also kind of easily links us to the last question today from Anushri. Am I pronouncing your name right? If not, you can interrupt also if you like. So good. All right. So Anushri has a question, I think, to everyone. So any of you who wants to respond, it is okay. And I would also like to ask Tyler to put it on YouTube if possible. So the question goes like this. Thank you for the wonderful presentations and discussion. Drawing on the debate between the structuralist and post-structuralist orientations to studying the urban and its various dimensions that Casper just referred to in his comments, How does the concept of material itineraries, and by extension infrastructures, encountered in the process, square against studying agency and agentive action as a way through which people, non-human things, or their assemblages move in relation to the urban and hence keep the urban moving? I'm particularly thinking about Southern urban theoretical frameworks that posit people as infrastructure and underscore their agentive acts of collaboration as a way to think about the urban. Well, that's a big question, especially for 5 minutes, but probably we can go over 5 minutes of the original schedule. So anyone who wants to reflect on this, people as infrastructure in urban theoretical frameworks.
I'll say something about that. Yeah, I think try to be quick. Malik's people as infrastructure is very good and indeed path-breaking. It has the curious inversion from the point of view of STS of emphasizing that if infrastructures are falling apart or don't even exist, then people will take on the capacities and competences of working together to effectuate something that resembles infrastructure. Okay, so that's one thing. This is not opposed, but it's slightly different. Is the assumption that there are going to be material itineraries, activity trails, and infrastructures, and that those infrastructures and material itineraries will shape what those people in the people as infrastructure are. So there's a question of ontological composition in a sense. And to say it very quickly with reference to what we've actually talked about here. So when Catherine talks about informal waste pickers, the informal waste pickers gain their capacities as subjects in Phnom Penh by their engagements with the waste in the infracycles there. If they weren't doing those rounds and picking that stuff and engaging with those depots, they wouldn't be those subjects. Yeah. So it's not that they are infrastructure, although in a way they are, but it is that they become subjects in the way they are in that manner. Okay. What is a subject that does this? That's an informal waste picker. How is it a subject? Because he, she, or it does this or that on a daily basis, which shapes their modes of existence and their ways of thinking, their ways of acting. These are, in a way, dated. I mean, not outdated, but dated. Like you couldn't be that kind of subject 100 years ago because there wouldn't be informal waste rounds to do or depots, right? It's the same with commuters in Thailand. You get to be a middle-class commuter in Thailand by the engagement with that infrastructure. The irritation is an emergent effect of that engagement, but it's not extant to you, it's part of you. So that's what it is. It's not people extant from infrastructure. It's co-constructed or constituted with. And in my case, which we didn't study, Chinese in Cambodia, they were, to be brief, hated. Then they became sort of saviors. Then they became hated again because of what they did with infrastructure. And now after pandemic, where almost all the Chinese are gone, they're neither hated nor loved. People are not talking about them anymore. This is in consequence of their relation to material itineraries of construction and destruction of various kinds. So there's no opposition, but it is assembled together, and that's the point. Yes, finish.
So that would be probably the time when I would say that's a good final remark, but I'm inclined to leave a little space for anyone else who wants to have a final last short comment from authors or readers. Anyone? If not, then we are just probably very, very good at timekeeping. So thank you all for also those of you who participated from YouTube, and also obviously those of you who presented and commented today. I think this is obviously an ongoing conversation. It's not going to finish here. So those of you who want to engage in it, I think the special issue now is open access, right, Casper?
Yes, it should be. I believe that that all our papers are freely accessible. Yeah.
Yeah, so now it's open access, I guess, so you can go back there to just a moment. Can you want to say something more? Yeah, I'm going to say a few words in a moment. Yes. So those of you who want to engage in the conversation, you can go back to the special issue and read it. And also, if those of you, and thank you very much for both the authors and the readers for today's participation. And for those of you who want to be part of this TransAsia network or just interested in what we are doing here, we have a Google mailing list, so you can. I think Tyler is going to put on the email where you can contact us to join to the mailing list. So it will be on the YouTube chat. Feel free to contact there and join the network. We have some not widely publicized small workshops. So for example, one of them will be next, in 2 weeks, September 30th, so in 2 weeks, Friday, where we are going to have 2 presentations, one from Lakshmi Pradeep from National University of Singapore, and he's going to talk about coral reefs and marine science in Lakshadweep Islands. And another presentation will be by Pankaj Seksharia from IIT Bombay and Naveen Tahil from IIT Delhi. And they are going to talk about their new book titled First Steps, Citizen Science in Ecology in India. So that's a more closed workshop. Those of you who are interested, you can join TransAsiaSTS by contacting the email and the YouTube chat. And there will be a public seminar like today's, which is planned sometimes end of October or beginning of November. It's not yet finalized. We'll have a guest speaker from Harvard University, historian Dr. Arunabh Ghosh is going to talk about his work. So you can just to repeat, subscribe to the TransAsiaSTS Google group, and thank you again, those of you who were here, and thank you to the Deakin Science and Society Network for hosting our event. Thank you, and see you in